Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we're talking to Reed Crawford. Reed is a PhD student in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He also recently published a paper on bat houses. Hi, Reed. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Hey, Shannon, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to talk about bats and bat houses today with you.
Oh, yeah, I'm really excited about this because I like bats and I've had the opportunity to work with them multiple times throughout my career. But one of the things I've learned with all my work with bats and with educational work is that bats are one of those groups of animals that really captures people's imaginations. Some people love them, some people hate them, some people aren't too sure what to think about them, but they really are these amazing animals that play a very important role in our ecosystem. And it always excites me that I'm hearing more and more people talking about wanting to put up bat houses and wanting to know what they can do to attract bats. So hopefully we can help with some of that today.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yes. But before we start talking too much about bats or your research on bat houses, let's just take a few minutes to introduce you to everybody. So can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I am a PhD student in the program in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I've been studying bats since about 2017. I got involved as an undergrad at the Indiana State University and then did my master's at Eastern Kentucky University, also working with bats in an area called Georgetown, Kentucky at Veterans Memorial Wildlife Management Area was one of my main study sites. And yeah, I've primarily been working with bats and bat houses doing research. A lot of my work falls under what you would call thermal ecology, so looking at the effects of temperature on bats, and then also looking at bat behavior in response to temperature, manipulating bat houses in different ways to sort of alter temperatures, see how the bats respond to that, and all sorts of things like that. So it's just pretty cool.
So I think it's fair to say that you're one of those people that love bats.
Oh, yes, definitely. I'm all about it.
Yes. So how did you get interested in bats?
So yeah, when I was an undergrad doing my bachelor's in biology, I was really interested in getting involved with wildlife, but I didn't really know, all the different sorts of things that I could potentially do out there. I didn't know what opportunities were really available to me. So I started looking around our department, and that's where I met my current advisor here at University of Illinois. She was back at Indiana State way back then, Joy O'Keefe, and she was a bat researcher doing a lot of bat wildlife research at several different places in the Eastern United States. So I started out volunteering with her. I really didn't know anything about bats back then. I didn't even know there was more than one species of bat in Indiana back then, which is pretty embarrassing to say. But yeah, I started volunteering at this site where we were monitoring a maternity colony of endangered Indiana bats. So that's just an aggregation of female Indiana bats that group together during the summer to rear their pups. So it's at this site sort of near Plainfield, Indiana. But we would go out there and we would do what they call spotlight checks. So we would check, there's about 40 or 50 bat houses out at that site. We'd go shine a little light quickly up in the roosts, see where the bats are on that landscape, note which roosts they're using and which ones they're not. And then that night we would go out there just after sunset, and we would actually count those bats as they emerge from the roosts at night. So monitoring the population size of those bats at that site. This was more of a long-term project, so it's been going on since about the 90s. They initially deployed about 3,000 bat houses at that site and largely had no bats use any of them since we didn't know as much as we do now. We've had a lot better success figuring out what they like, what they don't like on those landscapes. So definitely a work in progress, but that really got me going, seeing these bats, which is something I'd never encountered before. I really didn't get out in the woods at night doing that sort of thing. So I was really, fascinated by seeing all these bats grouping up in this area, coming out at night, emerging, see, 50 to 100 bats come out of some of these bat houses sometimes, which was pretty amazing.
Yes. It is always amazing to watch the bats come out of the roosts, whether it's the bat houses or out of the cave entrance or just out from the tree bark and stuff.
Right.
But yeah, and we'll talk more about some of those things that you mentioned in a couple of minutes. But I think it's also important. Let's just dispel some of those common bat myths that I'm heard a million times, and I'm sure you have too. with
Oh,
it.
yeah.
So let's see. Bats are not blind. They actually see pretty well.
Yeah. So I've done a little bit of work reading into that because that's one of the things we have to talk about a lot. And there was a recent paper that came out that was looking at the cognition of bats, but most bat families do have dichromatic color vision. So they have two what they call color opsons, but they have a short wavelength opsin, which is sort of the blue wavelengths and into the ultraviolet wavelengths. So bats can potentially see things we can't even see. And they have a short wavelength color opsin. So they're seeing more towards the red end of the color spectrum. And that's just getting, just barely getting into it. So we don't know a whole lot about bat vision, but there's a lot more to be explored there for sure.
Yeah. And it's hard to know exactly what they see because we're not bats. So it makes it, that's always a question when we're talking about animal vision is how do we relate that to what we see? Because it's not just the wavelengths we pick up, it's how our brains process that information.
Right. Yeah, so bats are interesting because they're also seeing with sounds essentially, and they can also use that visual information. So what their brains actually process is a little bit of a mystery to us, but it's pretty interesting for sure.
Yes, exactly. But they're not blind like we all have probably heard from the time we were kids. That's a very common myth. That's no.
Right. Yeah.
Yep. They're not going to fly into our hair unless you've got like a billion trillion bugs there or something, maybe, and then that's an accident. But yeah, it always amazes me how close they can pass by. And you never even realize they're there unless you've got the night vision scopes or the infrared on them and can see that way. But
yeah, I've stood out in front of hibernacular, bat houses. I've done hundreds of emergence counts and seen, hundreds and hundreds of bats. Sometimes they will swoop close to you, but I've never had one actually touch me. They know I'm there and they're really not interested in us at all. So yeah.
Yes, exactly. The only time that I've had them like super close to me too, or seen them close to people's, again, when you're like right next to the cave entrance or you're in their flight zone where they're kind of funneled through and they have to go through. Otherwise, you're too big. You're not a bug. So they're going to stay away.
Not useful to them. No, definitely not.
Yeah. Let's see. They're not the huge creatures that we see in the movies, or at least not the ones we have here in the Eastern US.
Right. Yeah. So most of our bats here in the United States are relatively small. So typically we're looking in the neighborhood of anywhere between 5 and 20 grams. Some of our bigger bats, like the hoary bat, may get up into 30 grams. One of our biggest bats in the Eastern United States is probably the Florida Bonneted Bat, which is also an endangered species. It wasn't actually recognized as its own species until about 2008, I believe. It was considered a subspecies of another type of free-tailed bat, but that one weighs about 60 grams, 40 to 60 grams in that range. So that's about as big as we get here in the Eastern United States. Worldwide, once you get into sort of the more of the flying fox type bat, so most of our bats are small insectivores here. The flying foxes do get bigger, but still they're not going to get more bigger than, a couple pounds at the most. And most of that's just their wingspan. It's just mostly long bones and fingers. They'll have up to maybe a 5 or 6 foot wingspan for the largest flying foxes, but yeah, most of our bats are very, very small here.
Yes. And to put that kind of into something that maybe some of our listeners might be a little bit more familiar with or able to picture a little bit easier, most of our bats in the Eastern US, they're maybe 3 to 4 inches long. A dollar bill is 6 inches long. So you're talking about half the length of a dollar bill, maybe a little bit more. So that's pretty small. And I mean, we've got smaller bats and we've got bigger bats, but our biggest bats, at least that I'm familiar with here in Kentucky, we're getting like 6 inches long type thing. So maybe the dollar bill. I'm thinking like the big brown bats and some of those.
Yeah. So our smallest bats are going to be the Eastern small-footed bat, which that one's going to weigh like 3 to 5 grams. Very tiny, very short wingspan. Most of our bats are going to have a wingspan between maybe 10 to 14, 15 inches, something like that. The bigger bats, like the hoary bats, maybe getting a little bit bigger. The Florida Bonneted Bat, which is probably one of the largest wingspans here, is about 20 inches at the most. So relatively way, way smaller than a lot of those other bats.
Yes, very definitely so. And that's a good point too, is that you have the length, which is kind of like from nose to tail, and then you've got wingspan. Wingspan's always going to be longer. I mean, think about us. We throw our arms out from fingertip to fingertip. That's pretty good distance.
Yeah, when bats tuck their wings in their arms and they're very, very small, very compact. That's why we see in those bat houses, you can get those really big colonies of bats all scrunched in there together.
Yes, it's like coming out of a clown car sometimes. How do they all fit in there? Yes. And then not all bats live in caves.
No, yeah.
Some of our bats live in caves during the winter and then go to other caves in the summer. Some will be in caves during the winter, and then they out in the woods in the summer. And we've got some species of bats that pretty much almost never go in caves.
Yeah, so there's a surprising variety in what bats are doing out on the landscape, and a lot of people just have sort of that, stereotypical images of bats are always in caves, which a lot of them do hibernate in caves during the winter and are, tied to those for that specific sort of thing to, avoid the harsh environmental conditions in the winter. But a lot of our bats are out on the landscape during the summer, particularly or primarily roosting in trees. So tree hollows are very important for certain species of bats, and also dead trees are very important for things like the endangered Indiana bat will roost under the bark. Peeling bark and cavities on dead trees are very important for those bats. So a lot of people won't even realize that if they have a dead tree or something in their yard, there may actually be bats using that for most of the year. So as a maternity roost or something like that. There are a few cave obligates. So one of the cave obligate bats that's going to use caves year round is like the gray bat, which is also an endangered species. That one does occur over a good portion of the Midwest. And that one's going to use caves year round. They also have documented that bats using bridges, so concrete bridges and things like that, sort of a similar sort of structure to a cave. And then you have bats like what we call our Lazarene bats or our hoary bats, our eastern red bats. Those bats are actually migratory. We don't exactly know where they migrate to, but they'll actually they range over a good portion of the United States, and they may fly farther south to get away from those cold temperatures and not hibernate at all. They still can hibernate, so red bats sometimes will get down into the leaf litter on the ground, and they'll actually curl up in there to hibernate for some period of time, but it's not super well studied for a lot of those bats. And then also, I believe the silver-haired bat is another one of those migratory bats. It's going to be moving across the United States and sort of getting away from those extreme temperatures.
Yeah, and that's something else that we don't think about with bats is migration. And yeah, some of them migrate, some of them do, some of them don't.
Yeah, and then we have the interesting scenario in Florida with the Florida bonneted bat. It's not experiencing those extreme temperatures, so it doesn't hibernate at all. And a lot of our bats, so they'll have a very strictly timed reproductive cycle, giving birth in the spring, rearing their pup over the summer, and then that pup's essentially flying it on its own by the end of the year when they go back for hibernation. But like the Florida bonneted bat in Florida, they may, since the weather's warm year round, they give birth multiple times per year. They don't really have that super set reproductive cycle like we see with most of our temperate bats here in the eastern United States.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that with the Florida bonneted bat because, well, I'm in Kentucky. I'm not in Florida.
Right,
so
yeah.
We definitely have seasons here. So, and all my bat work's kind of been Kentucky, Indiana, surrounding areas. So it's all seasonal. I totally forgot about, wait a minute, how's that reproductive thing work in Florida?
Yeah, so yeah, you do see a lot more of that when you get into more of those tropical, semi-tropical type environments. But yeah, it's definitely very structured for most of the eastern United States in terms of what's happening.
Yeah, that's cool. So can you think of any other myths that we're missing that we might need to break?
Let's see. So one of the more common ones is people think that most bats have rabies or all bats have rabies, something like that, which most mammals can be a vector for rabies. They can certainly carry it just like people can get rabies and be a rabies carrier essentially, or raccoons or stray dogs and things like that can all get rabies. But it's usually around less than 0.5% of wild bats actually do have rabies. So most of the time you're not going to see a rabid bat. If you're doing bat research and encountering wild, healthy individuals, if you do see a bat during the day, there is probably something wrong with it because they're not supposed to, be out and about. They should be somewhere hiding. So that's when you have to be more careful about those situations when you do see a bat doing something strange or unnatural.
Yeah, the incidence of rabies in bats is actually lower than in many of the other animals that we encounter more often. But one of the issues with bats is that, if you get bit by a dog, you know it.
Right.
If you get bit by a bat, their teeth are so small that you may not realize it. And rabies is one of those diseases that if you get it, that's it. There's been one case, maybe two, but I know of one. I think I heard of a second one in all of history that's been cured of rabies. And they had to do some major extreme stuff to do that. It was pretty much
definitely getting the rabies vaccination is definitely a preventative. And I don't know if the window of time is, there's a good amount of time after you get exposure to that you can get that taken care of with the post-exposure vaccine, or for like us wildlife researchers, you get the pre-rabies exposure vaccination, which is very good, very helpful. Not a ton of risk there once you're vaccinated and safe. So
yes, exactly. And if you're handling bats, you do need to have that pre-rabies vaccine.
Yes, definitely get that and wear
Yeah.
proper protection. So we typically wear like leather gloves when we're handling bats with rubber gloves over that to keep us safe and the bat safe from us. So yeah, definitely proper precautions are necessary when doing that.
Yes. But again, handling bats, just like handling any wildlife, is not something that you really want to just go out and do. You need to have the training. You need to have a reason to be doing it, those sorts of things. But yeah, so now that we've got some of those myths out of the way, let's talk about some of the things that bats are like and do in real life. And you've kind of brought up one of the things I wanted to start off with, because you're not the only one that at some point in time has thought that there's more than one species of bats. So we've mentioned several already, just kind of in passing, but about how many different species do we have here in the Eastern US?
So in the Eastern United States, we're looking in the neighborhood of about 18 different bat species. We do occasionally get vagrant species, coming from different areas that'll occasionally show up. In the United States in total, it's about 47 bat species. And then worldwide, we're looking at much, much more. So it's about 1,400 species, greater than 1,400 species. So one of the cool bat facts we like to say is that a greater than 20% of all mammal species actually are bats. So that's really cool. There's a surprising amount of diversity out there. They're second only to rodents in terms of diversity of species on the planet in the mammal class.
Yes, I mean, they are so interesting, so diverse, which is one of the things I love about them. And I guess since we are talking about diversity with the bats, one of the things that I also hear a lot, and I love hearing this, is I've started doing a lot of pollinator work and talking about pollinators and stuff. And when I ask people to name pollinators, I'm starting to hear more and more people say bats in that list, which is awesome, because I love the fact that people are recognizing that we have more than bees and butterflies that are pollinators, and that bats do play this additional role. But I'm in Kentucky, and most of the talks I'm doing and stuff are in the Eastern US.
Right.
And so here in the Eastern US, all of our bats are insectivorous. They eat insects. To find those pollinating bats, which are really important, you have to go southwest, down into the southwestern US, down into the tropics, into other areas.
Yeah, so that really depends on availability of those resources. So things like nectar, once you get down in those tropical regions, those resources are available year round for those bats to feed on, and they need that. Here we really don't have those. It's a limited time of year for those nectar resources, which our bats are also have an ephemeral resource when you talk about insects too. They're really not abundant during the winter, so that's why you see our bats hibernating. But those fruit bats and those nectar drinking bats are oftentimes associated with those more tropical latitudes. And there's a greater diversity of those flowering plants and things like that they can feed from down in those regions. So yeah, something unfortunately we don't have here in the Eastern United States.
Yes, exactly. But our bats are still really cool too.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So, our bats fall into two families here in the Eastern United States. We have Vespertilionids and we have Molossids. So Molossids are the free-tailed bats, which those are, more towards the southern states here in the East. And then the majority of our bats are those Vesper bats, which are also called the evening bats, even though there is a bat species called the evening bat.
Yeah, that can get it confusing.
Yeah, just a little bit. But yeah. So in areas like Kentucky, you have about 16 bat species. Up here in Illinois, we have about 13 bat species. Some of them are very rare and you don't see too much anymore, but others are more common on the landscape. Things like the big brown bat is one of the more common ones you'll see in people's houses and things like that. The little brown bat, pre-white nose syndrome, used to be one of the more common bats here in the Eastern United States, but I imagine we'll get into that after a while.
Yeah, we're getting ready to get into that pretty quickly. Yep. And then like on warm winter evenings, at least Kentucky South, I'm not sure how much kind of up where you're at, a little bit further north, but you'll see like sometimes a bat fly across the road, especially if it's getting later and we're starting to get some of those more of those insects out on the landscape. And those are often going to either be your big brown bats or your red bats.
Yeah. And a lot of times during the winter, like if it does get warm pulses, you'll actually see bats maybe actually venturing out on the landscape to try to grab a snack when there are, sort of those ephemeral patches of insects popping up, which is pretty cool. But yeah, most of the time, if you're more in an urban or rural environment, most of the time, if you see a bat flying, it's probably going to be a big brown or an eastern red bat, something like that. Those are our most common ones.
Yes. Or at least the easiest to see.
Easiest
because
to see,
they're
too.
Big.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes. So let's go ahead and get into some of that white nose syndrome stuff. So what are some of those threats that bats are facing? white nose syndrome's the big one right now, or one of the big ones.
Right. Yeah. So white nose syndrome is definitely number one. For the people that don't really know, a whole lot about that, it's just this fungal disease that we think was introduced from Europe to the United States. Got introduced into caves. So it's a fungus that's a cold-loving fungus, and it'll grow on the bats' exposed skin, so their wing membranes, their noses, and things like that. It makes that white sort of fluffy fungus on their face. It's really an irritant for the bats. So they're trying to go into torpor and hibernate for the winter to conserve energy, but this fungus irritates them. They'll arouse from hibernation and end up burning through their fat reserves before the winter is over. And that ends up making them starve to death essentially over the winter because they can't deal with that. During the summer, white nose syndrome isn't necessarily impacting the bats. They're having to heal from it in the spring, but because they're active, their immune system can respond to it. Whereas in the winter, their immune system is essentially shut down when they're in hibernation. So it's something important to think about when you consider white nose syndrome. And it's so deadly because the bats are, grouping in these big clusters. They can transfer the fungus to each other easily. And then another thing is people have been spreading it from cave to cave. So it made a big jump from the eastern United States all the way out to California and Washington, likely because people weren't decontaminating their gear and then they transferred spores to a different cave. So pretty deadly there. We've seen pretty severe decline. So the little brown bat, one of the more heavily impacted. The tricolored bat is another one of our eastern species that's been pretty heavily impacted by white nose syndrome. We've seen millions of bats die since it was introduced in about 2006. It was first discovered in New York State by some biologists there. And since it's, slowly worked its way westward, there have been remnant populations out east that appear to be recovering or at least stabilizing, but the populations, are severely reduced from what they used to be. So that one's a big deal for sure.
Yes, definitely. And when we say severely reduced, we're talking about in some cases 99% losses in certain areas. So we're talking severe. And when Reed is talking about the little brown bat and mentioning how common it used to be, that used to be one of our most common bats. We didn't necessarily see it as much, like see it out and about. But if you're a bat researcher, if you're doing research and studying them, that was like the most common bat in the world. I mean, talk about going out and seeing cardinals or robins, to put it with something people might be a little bit more familiar with. This was like everyday normal bat. I was like, oh, that's another little brown bat. And I was like, oh, look, there's a little brown bat in some places because it's so reduced in numbers and their population's been hit so hard.
Yeah, for context, like when we go mist netting, this was before my time since I started after white nose was introduced, but little brown bats used to be some of the more common captures when biologists would go mist netting out in these landscapes. Now you're hard pressed to even find one. In Indiana, it's not something we've caught in, 6 or 7 years. We haven't seen a little brown bat in our mist nets. So it's pretty crazy to think about, like just how drastic this fungus has changed the bat community in general. Some species don't seem to be as impacted, like the big brown bat, or bats that don't hibernate, the red bats or the hoary bats aren't necessarily at risk from this fungus as compared to our, already rare species like our myotis bats that are getting even, more heavily impacted by this fungus or experiencing even more severe declines than they already were.
Yes. And I have to give props to the caving community too, because as soon as it was discovered and as soon as we realized what was going on and what was happening, I mean, the caving community as a whole really came together and was like, okay, what do we need to do to be able to start reducing our impacts on it? And so there was a lot of protocols put into place really quickly for cleaning caving equipment, cleaning gear, things that you needed to do to be able to make sure that you had the least chance possible spreading it. So, I mean, yes, humans have spread it. I mean, there's no getting around that. But there's also been a lot of work put into place to minimize that risk and to try and make sure that we do no more harm than possible. But it also only takes one oops, and that can be it.
Yeah, that is a good point. People have done a very good job, of the majority of people of, taking the proper precautions to keep bats safe. But it is, those 1 or 2 scenarios where someone doesn't do it or someone's not paying attention to it. And then, it causes a chain reaction of sorts, which is unfortunate. But yeah.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, I thought that was important because I have interacted a lot with the caving community and I saw how they were responding right there at the beginning of white nose syndrome. And for those first like 10 or so years, I was like, Yeah, we need to make sure that they get props for all the good that they did with that.
Right. Yeah, I believe there's several organizations out there, like Cavers for Bats, I think is one that's out there for this sort of stuff. And I mean, the cavers are a valuable component to the bat community, especially in terms of discovering, new bat hibernacula that we potentially didn't know about before, exploring new caves and finding things that we didn't know were there. So definitely important.
Yes. So besides white nose syndrome, what are some of the others?
Yeah, so deforestation is a big deal, the loss of big, mature trees and forests, because a lot of our bats are dependent on forests in general for a big part of their life history, which is the reproductive cycle. So they need big trees, dead trees especially, to rear their pups in during the summer so that they can continue to survive. But with, expansion, agriculture, urbanization, a lot of those forests are getting chopped down. A lot of those big trees are getting lost in these landscapes. They do take a very long time to replenish because, a big tree or a big tree cavity can take decades and decades and decades to develop on that landscape. So it's something that the bats need, but don't necessarily have access to as much as they used to anymore. So they're hard pressed to find quality roosts in some areas because of the expansion and the lack of protection of those areas.
Yes. And then also being able to find foraging habitat. So finding those areas that have those, in many cases, more open areas. I mean, we have some bats that forage more in the forest and some bats that forage more in open areas, just like we have birds that do the same thing. So yeah, they need also those foraging areas that have lots of insects to eat for them. So we tend to focus a lot on the roosting habitat, but that foraging habitat is also important.
Yeah, you bring up a very good point, and this is something we're starting to think about a lot more when we're starting to do bat box deployments, which we can get into later, but is considering what the landscape around that area looks like in terms for what the bats are doing, because they spend, half their time during the day in that roost, but the other half of their time they're out on that landscape at night, really assessing what the quality that we're providing those bats is. In a lot of cases, trees can support an incredible diversity of, insects. They can provide a roost for the bats, but they can also provide, potential foraging resources because, moths, oak trees can support, hundreds and hundreds of different types of moths. And, native tall grass prairies can support lots of different types of insects, whereas agricultural fields or urban areas have a substantially reduced diversity in terms of what insects are available to the bats and sometimes decreased abundance of what food sources are available. So important considerations to think about for sure.
So other threats that you think we need to talk about?
The other thing we could talk about a little bit is climate change, because that may be important in the future here as well when we're thinking about bats and bat houses. So the threat of heat waves is another thing. So we're seeing that in Australia with flying foxes, particularly, dying in mass numbers because of these heat waves. That's something we'll have to consider with bats here in the United States, especially with bat houses and the overheating, which we can talk about a little bit later on. But that's definitely a big deal. The other thing is we're starting to see range shifts with some of our bat species. So some of those more southerly species are actually encroaching farther and farther north. So bats like the Mexican free-tailed bat or the Seminole bat, which is similar to the eastern red bat, are starting to expand their ranges, and you can potentially see interactions between species that weren't necessarily overlapping before, potential increased competitions with bats that were used to be, geographically isolated from each other. So that's something also to consider as well. I guess another one would be actually wind turbines too, is a pretty big deal here in the eastern United States as well. For those migratory bats in particular, so the hoary bats and the eastern red bats and the silver-haired bats are our primary bats that are getting impacted by wind turbines. So there's a big shift, for green energy, which is a good thing, or sustainable energy, but also mitigating those impacts to bats and birds too is a big deal with those wind turbines.
Yes. And that's an important point to bring up, because sometimes we think, oh, it's green energy, it's renewable energy. This is the perfect solution. There is no perfect solution. Everything has pros and cons, and looking at what they all are and doing that balancing act is so important.
Right. Yeah, and trying to mitigate those challenges is very difficult. They've done a variety of things with wind turbines, looking at what wind speed outside has to hit before they turn on the blades, let those start spinning. Windier conditions, the bat's going to be less likely to fly. It's too difficult to fly if it's really windy for those bats, so they may be safer in that case. People have been experimenting with like ultrasonic acoustic deterrence, so trying to jam the bat's sonar around those wind turbines so they're more likely to avoid it. And those have had some success in terms of deterring or reducing mortality events, but it's still hundreds of thousands of bats a year getting killed by wind turbines, which when you don't know the actual population size of the bats you're studying, it can be a little scary to think about.
Yes. Or we already have something going on that's taking out 99% of the population, and then we're taking out that percentage of a 1%. Yeah, it can get very scary. But I'm going to say that probably the thing that most of us as individuals have the most control over, or could probably do the most about, is habitat, and looking at habitat on our own properties and maybe within our communities if we can start getting that broader group going. Mm-hmm. So that kind of leads directly into what you've been studying a lot and doing a lot of research on, is bat houses and things like that. So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about your research?
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, my research is mostly focused on bats and temperature and bat houses as well. So during my master's, we were looking at how different bat box designs impact the internal temperature of the bat house itself for the bats, and what the bat's sort of roost selection response was to those different bat house designs and to those different landscape placements. So we would vary the amount of solar exposure those roosts were getting for the bats. So we had 5 different designs of bat houses placed in different areas on the landscape. So we had fully shaded bat houses, we had evening sun, morning sun, and then full solar exposure. And we were looking, working with Indiana bats in this case, in Kentucky and in Indiana, looking at the roost selection response. We found some really cool things when we were doing this. So we found that in terms of overheating, which is a big deal for bats. So just for context here, I guess, before I get into it. So overheating has been increasingly reported as a big deal in bat houses. So temperatures greater than 40 degrees Celsius, which is about 104 degrees Fahrenheit, is stressful to a lot of our bats. And temperatures, exceeding that by a few degrees can actually be lethal and actually kill the bats, which is something we weren't necessarily investigating before. We assume that, bats like warm roosts and warm habitats to roost in because it helps their pups, speeds up growth and development of their pups. And we've been recommending for a long time that people paint their bat houses black and things of that nature, which we've actually started investigating the temperatures in those bat houses and found out, well, it's actually getting way too hot for those bats. Maybe on a normal day, it's fine, but if you get those warmer days in the upper 80s and 90s, it can actually become dangerous for those bats to be in there. So that's something we've really been looking in, how to reduce that effect, but still keep the roost, warm enough for those pups so it's still beneficial for reproduction is sort of the challenge there we're getting at. But yeah, in terms of looking at roost selection, we found out that bats actually need a variety of different roosts depending on what reproductive state they're in, what reproductive condition they're in. So for a long time, people have just been recommending putting up a bat house in a solar exposed location, but we found that bats will actually use bat houses in a variety of different spots. So early in the spring, we found bats actually using bat houses in the forest interior, which is something we didn't typically associate with reproductive bats. We have a variety of hypotheses for why they were doing that, but for 3 years now, during the months of May and April, we've actually seen Indiana bats roosting in bat houses in the forest interior. And we think this is because the bats think they're roosting in a dead tree, which is, really unstable, prone to wind throw. The weather's really variable in the spring, and they may actually be more buffered, and they think they're more safer in those forest interior locations. And also the other consideration here is that the leaf out hasn't occurred in the canopy, so those roosts aren't fully shaded yet in the early spring, so they are still getting sunlight, and they may potentially be safer from those, windy extreme weather conditions during the spring. But then once leaf out occurs during the summer, so we get to those warmer temperatures, more stable temperatures, early midsummer, we saw bats shifting to those more solar exposed locations on the landscape. So the morning sun and the evening sun locations, we started seeing bats using those locations more. Those roosts are a lot warmer than those forest interior roosts. And we found that once the bats gave birth, so they enter their lactation stage where they're rearing their pup, they're primarily using these bat boxes that were along this east-facing tree line. So it's getting morning sun. It heats up faster in the morning, which may actually be beneficial for those young pups. As the adults are out foraging at night, that roost actually cools down since you don't have the body heat from the adult warming that roost. It may be really beneficial to have a roost that hits the sunlight early in the morning and starts warming up faster, as opposed to an afternoon box, which isn't going to heat up till much later in the day when it gets its sunlight. But we also saw what was interesting was later in the year, once the adult bats reach their post-lactation stage, when the pups are taking care of themselves, essentially at that point, flying towards the end of the summer, we saw a lot of those bats shift to those afternoon solar exposed bat boxes. And there could be a variety of reasons for that as well. But another one we think is the adult bats, they're not taking care of the pup. They're likely to enter torpor during the day to save energy. The females are primarily just staying warm during the day to help their pup develop. So for context, bats are heterothermic, so they can maintain a high warm body temperature if they want to, but it's energetically expensive to do that. So a lot of the times, if they're not taking care of the pup, they'll drop into torpor, save energy when they can. But, costs and benefits, they have to help their pup grow. They're going to stay warm when they can to help their pup develop faster. So it has a higher chance of that pup surviving the first winter.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
And
once
we should probably point out real quick here, torpor. You want to give a nice, easy definition for it?
Yeah, so torpor is just a controlled reduction in body temperature and metabolic rate for the bats, so they can lower their temperature and their metabolic rate. It's essentially a shortened version of hibernation. They can use it on the scale of like, a couple hours to a few days if they want to. But yeah, so it's a great way for bats to save energy, but it does come at cost. So their activity is much lower, their immune system response is lower. And yeah, for pups, that's detrimental because they can't grow when their immune system or their metabolic rates are so low, they can't grow and develop as quickly. So that's sort of the costs and benefits of being warm versus being cold, energy saving versus growth and reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, once the pups are volant and on the landscape by themselves, we see the bats shift those evening solar exposed roosts. And we think that's because the bats are going to use torpor during the day, which we'll get into, but they'll stay cool during the day. And then that roost heats up in the afternoon. That could potentially be good. The bats can passively rewarm to an active body temperature just before they get ready to leave at night to go forage on that landscape. So there's potentially some cool things that we're going to start investigating with those bats in those bat houses to see if we can get sort of the physiological aspect of what's happening in those bat houses. But yeah, I guess the main takeaway from that research was that bats need a variety of different roosts on the landscape to sort of meet their changing needs as the year progresses.
Which we never really, I mean, it's one of those things that kind of makes sense when you stop and think about it, that they would do that, because I know, having done bat research and chased them with the radio telemetry equipment before, they don't always go back to the same location or the same tree. I mean, if you've got a maternity roost and a mom with her pups stashed somewhere, well, that's a different story. But otherwise, they don't always go to the same location. So why would we expect them to use the same bat houses or the same location with our bat roosts that we're putting up, the artificial ones, all the time, if they don't do that in nature?
Right. Yeah. And those are interesting questions. And we really don't fully understand what's going on. We have a variety of ideas. So we think changing weather conditions change what's happening inside the roost. And they may, switch back and forth between structures that meet their needs. If it's colder, if it's too hot, they can move around on the landscape to find what they want. But we also think that parasites are a big deal that they try to avoid. So there are parasites called bat bugs, which are essentially little blood suckers that will get on them. They have wing mites that'll also drink their blood and things like that. And if they stay in a roost too long, those parasites can build up within that structure. Or if they're in there with, a bunch of individuals, they're more likely to have, parasites transferring between individuals and on each other. So they may switch to different roosts over the course of the year to avoid that. And they may also do it for a predator avoidance reason. So they may think that they're at risk of getting eaten by something if they stay somewhere for too long. They may be more obvious. So they may switch around on the landscape to be more unpredictable to predators and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that we don't know with bats. And so, I mean, it's really cool and interesting. And I mean, I love learning. That's part of science, is you're always learning. So yeah, it's really interesting to start seeing these questions continue to be asked and looked at in the natural landscape, but then to see those start coming back, and how can we apply it in our own built environments, in our backyards, in our front yards, in our communities and stuff. And so it's great. I love the fact that you're doing that. You're helping us learn more.
Right. Yeah. And I guess if we want to get more to the overheating side of things, because that was a lot looking at the roost selection of those particular bats. So looking at like what bat box design modifications we've been doing, we've been messing with looking at different types of ventilation on the bat houses to try to reduce those really high temperatures or extreme temperature events. We've also been making modifications to the mass of a box. So a bigger box will have what you call a higher thermal mass. So it's going to take more energy for that box to heat up and cool down, which could potentially buffer those bats from extreme temperatures. So you can think about it as a bigger box as being closer to a big tree hollow or something like that. You have a big, massive tree that's going to take a lot of environmental energy to actually change the temperature inside that structure. And what we've found we've had the best success with is either, you change the paint color of the box. So the surface reflectance, if you use a lighter color, it will reflect more of the sunlight. It will be cooler inside. But the other downfall is it can actually be too cool, and it might not warm up enough for those pups, to develop properly. But when we make these modifications to the thermal mass of the structure, make a bigger structure, we see it's more robust to those extreme temperatures, but it can actually retain the body heat generated by the bat itself much better than those other bat boxes where we just change the paint color. So the bats could promote a warm enough temperature for the pups within the box without, the added inputs of solar radiation. And that box will actually stay warmer through the night. So the inverse side of the issue is a lot of our small bat boxes will actually just drop immediately to ambient temperature a few hours after sunset once they're not getting solar radiation anymore, which could potentially be a problem because tree hollows and dead trees, they're big, they'll hold heat for longer at the night, and that could potentially be warmer for that pup when the adults leave. So that's something we're trying to simulate with these bigger bat boxes, is trying to capture that heat that was generated during the day to sort of make that more beneficial for those bats.
Yes. And when you say bigger, how much bigger is bigger?
So in terms of roosting space for our we were using what's called a rocket box style bat house, which I can send you a link to that as well. We got some plans on the ISU Bat Center's website, which is where I used to be working as an undergrad and affiliated with during my master's research. And also Bat Conservation International has plans for rocket boxes, but the roosting space we offered to the bats was the same, but we added more material to the outside of the bat box. So we made this box called the water jacket box. So we just added an extra wood layer around it that had an air pocket inside it that we filled with water packets to increase the mass of the roost itself. So just adding more to the outside. These roosts, for context, we generally like a longer bat house. These are about 3 feet long. So we try to promote a temperature gradient inside the bat house so the bats can shift up or down within that roost, really have a lot of options to choose from during the day. And these roosts that we're using, the rocket box is built around a post typically. So it has roosting space on 4 sides. So we align them north, south, east, and west so the bat can shift, around that roost as well as up and down within that roost, depending on what they need.
Mm-hmm. So essentially you put a jacket on it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the basic concept. Yeah.
But yeah. And so with the rocket boxes, because I know I'm kind of familiar with them because I've seen them and stuff like that, but they look very different than what most of the bat boxes that you typically see online or in stores or stuff like that. Very different than what we would have put out even 10 years ago. I mean, rocket boxes have been around for that long, but we've really started to change and develop the way that we do things based on research like what you're doing and many other projects.
Yeah, so a lot of the more traditional bat houses that you see are those flat-faced bat houses. They're usually 1 or 2 or 3 chambers sometimes on those. And we've started, experimenting with these other designs because we're trying to better replicate a tree, essentially, is what we're doing. Those flat-faced bat houses can be good in some cases. Multiple chambers, offer a variety of temperatures for those bats, but they're really restricted to, one plane where they're roosting one direction. Wherever you face that box is what they're stuck with, essentially. Whereas, with a rocket box structure, something built around a pole or a post, they really can move around more naturally within that structure and have a variety of things offered to them within it.
Right. And these rocket boxes, I mean, there's something that a homeowner could put out just as easily, really, as they could one of the traditional flat-faced ones as well.
Right. Yeah. So at this point, I've probably built around 50 or 60 different rocket boxes. So it's definitely something people can do. I mean, there are plans and stuff online for doing that, and you can definitely get this up in your yard if that's something you're interested in doing. It's definitely feasible. Some of those flat face boxes can be a little bit easier since they're smaller, they're easier to move around and stuff like that, but they're not necessarily as good as one of those bigger structures are for the bats.
So for a homeowner, what would you recommend if they were thinking about, well, maybe I want to put up a bat box, or what can I do to improve bat habitat just around my home? What are some of the recommendations you might give?
Right. So yeah, just looking at the landscape context in general. So you want to think about, like you had mentioned earlier, the foraging resources offered to the bat and the roosting resources offered to the bat. So things like planting trees and native flowering plants and wildflowers are a good place to start, as well as roosting habitat, but promoting plant growth for a diversity of insects and things like that. So food for the bat to eat is something you need to think about, as well as clean water sources, which can be difficult to get in more urbanized landscapes. So that's also something to think about. In terms of bat houses, so if you're selecting a bat house to put up on your landscape, because a lot of these landscapes, big hollow-bearing trees aren't something you can actually find for those bats, and the bats are probably roosting in like someone's house or a barn or something like that if there isn't like a bat house available. But some of the main things to consider when you're looking at like putting up a bat house is location. So typically for a maternal bat, so one that's going to be rearing a pup, they're going to want that solar exposed location. So south, east, or west facing aspects are generally the most productive in terms of getting bats to use that structure. Height above ground, so our rocket boxes, the top of those boxes are at 20 feet above ground, but anywhere between 10 and 20 feet is generally okay for a bat house. I've seen bats use bat houses that are only 6 feet off the ground, which is a little crazy and a little. I see that as being more dangerous for the bats because people can easily knock that structure over, or animals can more easily interact with a lower bat house. Things like raccoons and snakes and things might access that easier. So higher above ground is generally better for the bat house, also for the bat too, because a lot of people don't know, but most bats can't take off from the ground if they're landing on the ground. They'll have to crawl up something to be able to take off. So what bats do is they'll let go from wherever they're roosting and drop down. They have to gain speed, and then they'll open their wings to swoop and take off. Most bats can't just take off the ground or jump off the ground to take off. Only a few bats can actually do that. So they do need that proper space to drop from their roost to take off.
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, a few other things in terms of installing a bat house. So the height of the bat house is a big deal. Longer bat houses, larger bat houses, we generally see is better if it does start to overheat. So typically overheating occurs at the top of the bat house. If it's a long bat house, the bats can just shift down to lower and lower roosting positions to avoid those potentially dangerous temperatures. And color is another thing to consider here as well. So we used to recommend those really dark shades for most of the United States, but we're starting to push towards more lighter colors, which we don't have great research on it yet, but we're actually working on a project where we're testing a variety of different paint colors on these 3-chambered flat-faced bat houses. So we've got an unpainted box, and then we paint it white, and then we'll add 20% black to the paint mix until we're at a fully black bat house. So hopefully we'll be able to say, based on temperature and solar radiation, what's the best cost benefit? So minimizing the risk, but still promoting, safer temperatures for those bats. Mm-hmm. But at the current moment, we just recommend light to medium shades at the most for the Eastern United States, whichever color you really prefer, light greens, browns, and things like that.
Yeah. And that'll be interesting research when you get it done to be able to know exactly when. And based on what you said earlier, it's not going to surprise me if it's like you need 4 different shades for 4 different seasons, and it's kind of that gradient. Give them those options to move around.
Right. Give them the option and the freedom to sort of choose that. Yeah, as well. And we're also looking at material with this study as well. So typically bat boxes are made of pine or cedar, but we're also bringing some higher density wood. So looking at oaks, we've got an oak box, which when we built that thing, it was substantially heavier than an identical pine box. So potentially could buffer temperature a lot better, even though it is, more expensive to build a box out of oak than pine. And we also have some boxes where we've actually put reflective metal sheeting on it, so a different way. So it'll hopefully be similar to like a white bat house that's going to reflect a lot of the sunlight. That may have a similar effect as well. So interesting stuff, though. We'll see what happens, but hopefully we can give a lot better guidance on terms of what we should be painting these bat houses.
Yes. And my brain sometimes goes in weird directions, but when you were talking about the metal sheeting on it, I'm wondering how that might also not just changing the temperature in there, but if it rains or during the fall and we've got the acorns and the walnuts dropping on everything, I'm thinking metal roofs, ping, 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 and then how even the ultrasonic that we may not even hear of that also begins to affect bat behavior and everything on the inside.
Yeah, that is a very good point too, and how the bats actually perceive that structure, because it's going to be reflecting echolocation calls much differently than just a regular wood bat box. It may have more of a mirror effect, which what we've been recommending actually is, so this paint color study we're doing is like an exclusion study. So we block bats from going into these roosts with a wire mesh over the entrances, so we can assess just generally what the temperature profiles are in these bat houses before we offer them to bats. The next step is, once we select that subset of bat boxes that we think could be okay for these bats or safe for these bats, we can then put them up on the landscape and assess different responses to these different structures. So we could potentially see something like you had mentioned with those metal boxes, that they might not actually like it for reasons other than the temperature profile in it.
Yes, I mean, there's always these other complications. It's never one single thing. I mean, we tend to look at one thing because we have to look at one thing at a time. You can't look at everything. It just doesn't work that way. But then you have all these other interactions that just make you go, sometimes.
Head scratchers a lot. Yeah.
Yes. But yeah. So what else about your research? What other things are you studying with it?
Yeah, so we had spent a lot of time looking at the temperature of the bat house itself. For my PhD research now, we're actually starting to look at the temperatures of the bat itself too. So we're starting to actually go out on these landscapes. We'll capture, we're working with Indiana bats again, so we're capturing these bats. We'll actually stick temperature sensitive radio transmitters on the backs of these bats, which allow us to monitor their body temperature. So this transmitter will put out a pulse. The pulse allows us to locate the bat so we can track it to a tree or something, or a bat house. But the pulse rate actually varies by what the bat's body temperature is. So it'll speed up if the bat's getting warmer, and the pulse rate cools down as the bat gets colder. we can convert those beats per minute to an actual temperature of the bat. So we can see a bat in this type of roost is using, doing these sorts of things in terms of its body temperature. So we're going to be comparing natural roost to artificial roost in terms of what the bats are doing with their body temperature. And we can also look at different bat house designs and see what are these bats doing inside those different roost structures with different temperature profiles. So it'd be very interesting to see.
Yes, I've definitely got to read your paper and your stuff when you get done, because that's going to be really cool.
Oh yeah, this should be interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening now. So we've got a couple papers in review right now where with those bat boxes in Kentucky, we actually use those temperature data to estimate energetic expenditure of bats in a couple of different scenarios. So like a bat using torpor when it gets too cold, or a reproductive bat maintaining a constant body temperature all the time, and looking at the cost benefits of those different bat house designs in those different landscape positions. So yeah, all this research combined will hopefully have a much, much better picture of what we're doing.
Which is going to be interesting because, like I said, more and more people are wanting to know what they can do to bring in the bats and to help the populations. And we've always made guesses. Now we're going to start to have the research to modify what we were guessing at and to really make it to do well and to do the best we can, which is what we're all wanting to do.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was unfortunate because, people have been putting up bat houses with good intentions for a long time, but then you do see some of these, like overheating is a potentially negative effect that we didn't necessarily recognize for a long time. But we can easily improve upon these things too. Once we get into investigating it, we can say, oh, it's just, modification of color and material that we can make this thing safer for bats. It's like, oh, well, these bat houses weren't, that beneficial because we were putting them in the wrong place. So it's just a matter of moving it around. One of the more common questions I get is like, I put up this bat house, why aren't there bats in it?
Yes, that's what I was about to ask about.
Yeah. I mean, there's a million different ways to answer that question. It's like, where is it? Where are you? What landscape are you on? What type of bat house did you buy and where did you put it? How high above ground is that? There's all sorts of these different factors that can be influencing those things, but it's really, site specific, context specific when you're looking at putting up bat houses. So a lot of variables.
Yes, lots and lots of variables. But if it starts to get to be where we have more of this research that can back up, then maybe we can start to say, oh yeah, I put a really dark bat house in this really super sunny area that has no trees, no shade. Okay, that starts to make sense why I might not have had them. And we can start to apply and make better guesses as to where the bats might like, because the bats are going to choose where they want to go anyway.
Right. Yeah. And it's a matter of making it safer for the bats, because a lot of the times if we put a bat house up in, a good spot, but we put up, one of those dangerous black bat houses, they'll use it because, most of the time it's warmer during the day than, like, say, a white bat house. They might actually preferentially select that, but it's on that 1 or 2 days a year where it actually gets very, very hot is when it actually gets really dangerous for that bat to be there. That's sort of that danger scenario. It's preferentially selecting that roost because it's warmer on average, but then you do have the increased risk for those extreme events there. So
yeah, and we don't, like you said, we don't want to harm the bats with our good intentions either. So finding that balance is important.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, but I mean, the good news is, like, at our Indiana field site where they've been doing this work since the 90s, the population there has been increasing over that time period with those roosts. We don't know if these, are the same individuals or, pups being born, or if they're individuals migrating from somewhere else to this field site. We do know that population there has been increasing over the time that we've been doing this work.
Nice. That's always good to hear.
Yeah,
especially with Indiana bats.
Yeah,
because I mean, they've been on the endangered species list since there was an endangered species list.
Right. Yeah, one of the first species on that. Yeah.
Yes. And again, they're one of the ones that was been hit hard by white nose syndrome. So yeah,
unfortunate. Yeah.
So what is the most interesting, surprising thing that you've seen with your bat research, or just out in the field?
Oh, out in the field. Well, the surprising thing is the variation in just personalities you get with different bats that we catch in the nets. I mean, there's just a variety of, some of them are really goofy. Some of them are really nice, really shy. Some of them are, can be aggressive if they think, you're trying to eat them when you're pulling them out of a mist net or something like that. But just seeing that variation and what bats are doing of even the same species, there's just so many different personalities out there to try to see. And I do think of these bats as, more being, they're similar to, people in terms of their personalities and their variation and what they do. And it's very cool. And also looking at like their parenting behavior. Indiana bats are very good mothers to their pups. They take care of them. All these bats, all these females group together to help each other, with this goal of rearing their pups, which is pretty amazing. And we really don't know a whole lot, about the social structure of bats, but they have all sorts of different social calls that they make, all sorts of different information that they can convey to each other that we really don't have a great understanding of at this point. But there's a lot going on there that we can still figure out and discover with these bats, which is pretty cool.
Yes, definitely. So is there anything else that you'd like to share with us before we kind of start to wrap this up?
So yeah, I'd like to just mention that, like, if you're interested in bat conservation, that's a great thing. And I hope you do get more invested into it, looking either into bat houses, or potentially another thing is bat acoustics is another big way to get people involved. So citizen science is a big deal, and it's increasingly becoming more important in the bat world and other wildlife worlds. So any way you can get involved, get out there, get information about bats, improve the public perception of bats is great. And I think people should definitely get involved in with that if they can.
Oh, yes. I've always been a big fan of citizen science or community science. It's the same thing, two different names for the same thing. But yeah, so that's always a great way with anything nature related, outdoors related, because there's so much that we want to learn and we just don't know. And I know as white nose syndrome came through and took out, especially in the early days, was taking out these 99% of the population of some of our most common species of bats. A lot of the bat researchers were saying, wow, we wish that we had studied this more and learned these things when they were common.
Right.
But we focus so much on the non-common things because the common things were always going to be there. And now all of a sudden they're not there, and really trying to learn. So citizen science or community science is a great way to help bolster that knowledge base and that science, because there are only so many researchers and they're just like everybody else, can only be in one place at a time and do so many things. And having more eyes on the ground and more people helping to look is always beneficial.
Yeah, you're definitely right there. Definitely getting involved if you can is the best way to do that. And it's the best way to be more impactful, to make people's research get implemented on a large scale, is really the benefit that I see there as well. And the more people we get involved, the more questions we can definitely answer. There are definitely a limited number of bat researchers out here. So, and like with me, I'm only looking at bat houses, but there, we've talked about, there's so much more out there that needs to be addressed that people can really help answer some of those really big questions. And I think, volunteering as well for a lot of these different projects is fun. I started volunteering with bats, and then now I'm doing a PhD on it, and 5 years later down the road. So you never know where things will go.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, this has been really awesome and lots of great information here. So if people have questions, can they contact you?
Oh yeah, definitely. So yeah, my email is reeddc2@illinois.edu. So extra D is for my middle name.
Yeah, don't worry about trying to write that down, everybody. I'm going to have it in the show notes like I always do. So I know scribbling down things is always hard on podcasts.
Yep. Definitely feel free to email me any bat questions, any bat advice you want. I'm happy to answer those questions. I love answering those questions. Outreach is a big part of my job, and I definitely like doing it. So
yes,
certainly do that.
Thanks. And you had said that you had some other papers and stuff that you might be able to send me. So I will put links also in the show notes for those of you that want to learn more to Reed's research on the bat houses, possibly some other papers that he recommends. And then we're going to try and put some links in as well to not quite so technical stuff as well, that will be a little bit easier to read, but also have like plans and stuff. And I know, Reed, you and I were talking through email and stuff, the research lab that you're involved with your PhD, you're looking at actually putting up some of that information resources on your lab webpage too, correct?
Yes. So yeah, we are working on a few versions of that. So we're going to have a tips for safer bat houses page that we're going to get up online. And then hopefully we'll be able to incorporate, as our research starts coming out, we'll incorporate more and more of those ideas into our webpage. So yes, I can send you the link as well for my advisors lab page. It's the UIUC Human Wildlife Interactions Lab that we'll get that up there. And then hopefully can stay tuned and see when that stuff comes out on there.
So yes, I will definitely put that out there on the show notes on the webpage so that people can find that very easily. And then as you add to it, it's just going to be there. But yeah, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Yeah, no problem. This has been fun. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay, great. Have a great day.
Thanks, Shannon. Bye.
Yep, bye-bye. I appreciate Reed taking the time to talk with us today. I think bats are really fascinating animals, and I enjoy watching them forage around our house or wherever I get to see them. I also think it is exciting that more and more people are starting to join me in my appreciation and interest in bats. It makes me happy when people ask about putting up bat houses and making their properties more attractive to bats. I may not always have the answers to questions like, why aren't the bats using the house I put up? Because, like Reed said, there isn't an easy answer. But I also don't mind trying to help figure out possible answers to that question. And hopefully, it'll get easier to answer those questions as research such as Reed's helps us gain a better understanding of what conditions bats need when they are roosting and how we can best provide those conditions. Before I wrap this up, I wanted to let you know about my new book, Attract Pollinators and Wildlife to Your Yard, 15 Free and Easy Ways. It is designed to provide you with those quick and easy wins that you can do to make your yard more pollinator and wildlife friendly. It is especially helpful for those who want to get started but are maybe a little overwhelmed or don't want to wait for something to grow. Visit the webpage for this episode to learn more about the book and to place your order. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.